Good afternoon. It is with great pleasure that I introduce today's speaker, one of Villanova Law School's most distinguished graduates, David Worby, who is the lead counsel for the 10,000 rescue and cleanup workers who labored at Ground Zero. This story began on September 11, 2001, with the terrorist attack on the World Trade Center. On that day, we had Officer John Walcott, 34-year-old police officer who was working in Manhattan and who was one of the first responders at Ground Zero. In 2003, he was diagnosed with leukemia, and he sought compensation on the basis that he was exposed to toxic dust and was not adequately protected. No one would take his case. It was considered at that time unpatriotic to say anything against the cleanup. Eventually, someone suggested that he go and get in touch with David Worby. So David took a cause that no one else wanted, and he started a suit on behalf of one single police officer. But there were many others who were injured, who got sick after working on Ground Zero. Firemen, rescue workers, other police officers. And that case that started with one cop grew to over 10,000, a class with over 10,000 members. And after years of litigation and investments of millions of dollars by David and his firm, his efforts paid off for the first 9/11 first responders with an over $800 million settlement. But David didn't just stop at the courthouse. He also lobbied Congress to pass the James Zaragoza 9/11 Health Compensation Act of 2010. And this act will make another $2.5 billion available to people who became ill after working on Ground Zero. We're honored to have David here today, that he's agreed to return to Villanova to share his perspectives on really his extraordinary work on behalf of the 9/11 first responders. It really has no doubt been a long journey for David, from a student here at Villanova Law School, where he was on the law review, he was a member of our national trial team, and he won the remote court competition, to one of the nation's top trial lawyers. But throughout that journey, David has exemplified what it means to be a true Villanova lawyer, one who promotes the common good and plays an active role in shaping the world around them. Please join me in welcoming back to Villanova, David Worby.
Thank you, Dean, and thank you, Colleen, for organizing this trip. And thank you to all the professors and faculty and staff and alumni who are here sharing this day with us. It's my privilege to come back to Villanova, and it's my pleasure to donate things in this law school that I loved so much and still do. It was around 2003, a couple of years after the 9/11 debacle, that I was in Nashville writing music. I had decided that I wanted a second career in songwriting and in film writing, and decided to start working part-time. I had, after law school, determined that I wanted to go to a small law firm rather than a large law firm, so I could make my way as a trial lawyer a little more quickly. And I had built a large practice in Westchester County, and at one point, when I had to start raising 3 children every other week, I said, I think I'm going to give up a large part of the practice, have a boutique firm, and I started writing music, and I started writing film, and it doesn't pay for the clinical offices here, but it's done nicely for me. So I'm down there writing music in Nashville. My office calls me. This Detective Walcott has called 3 times. I said, who is he? He said, he's your son's hockey coach. I said, what? He said, yeah, he's the hockey coach at Fox Lane High School, which is Mount Kisco, New York, in Westchester County. But during the day, he's a cop, and he has leukemia, and he wants to talk to a lawyer about whether or not his exposure on the pile for 6 months at some point, when we had about 70 or 80 people, I knew that we had to put it in suit, and I knew I was getting into John Travolta country in terms of what might happen to my law firm if this thing went south. But if you talk to these cops and firemen who were there for us, and all the construction workers and all the volunteers, and Sister Cindy Mahoney, a nun who I traveled to South Carolina to visit with, who almost died in front of me. She was on a respirator. She was the first clergy person present. She was just 2 days on the job, and she wrote her name in magic marker on her arm in case she died when she went down there, the people would know who she was. And she blessed remains and flying bodies, etc. And she stayed there for 6 months, got very sick, and the church wouldn't take care of her. So I went down to South Carolina met with her, and the Post put it on the cover. And one by one, the newspapers called me a charlatan, especially the Daily News, one of my favorite papers. And they said I invented 9/11 syndrome, and it doesn't exist. And at the time, the hospitals who were treating these people, NYU and some others, and Mount Sinai, said there's not enough evidence yet. And then I met with John Howard, who is the director of health for the United States of America, and he came to my office, and I spelled out to him what I thought happened. I said, here's what I think happened. Cops and firemen and construction workers have pre-existing exposures to debris, to smoke, etc. I talked to the cops. They said the first few years, more often than not, they're attending fires, and unlike firemen, they're not wearing masks, so they're exposed to smoke. So the latency periods that we discovered in fireman presumption cancer studies, that firemen get certain cancers, lung cancer, blood cell cancers, etc., would be different for people who had pre-existing exposure. And then I remembered learning in torts in first year here, the eggshell skull rule, that you take the plaintiff the way you find them, that if these people had a pre-existing exposure, and that's one of the reasons they were getting sicker faster. And then from there, I lectured at Yale Medical School about the cross-accelerant behavior of dioxin, which most of you have heard of Vietnam War, but don't know much about it. Dioxin was the disease thing that everyone got sick from after Vietnam, that they're still fighting over, Agent Orange. And there was a huge amount of dioxin. So it so happens that when dioxin mixes with neurotoxins like lead and mercury, and then also with asbestos, it accelerates the latency periods of why people get sick, because it decreases their immune system so that they can't fight off the growing illness inside of their bodies. So I presented that to Howard and to Yale, et cetera, and they said, you know something, David? In all likelihood, you're right, but just like with Agent Orange, just like with asbestosis, just like with lung cancer from cigarettes, we need 15 to 20 years to prove it. I said, I don't have 15 or 20 years, although it ended up being 10. I said, I certainly don't have 15 because these people are dying. I said, more people are going to die from cancers and diseases from this exposure than died on 9/11. And we've had close to 1,000. What really happened is the court of public opinion started voicing itself. In large part because I spent 3 years doing 1,000 television, magazine, newspaper reports, et cetera, and every time I had a different plaintiff with me telling their story, a cop, a fireman, et cetera, the nun, as to how they got sick, how sick they were. People would come on respirators, because the court of public opinion should have been supportive of the country. The country did nothing wrong. We were bombed, okay? But that didn't mean that these people deserve to be protected. And it's not a question of blame, it's a question of taking responsibility. These are our cops, our firemen. They went down there, our construction workers, our emergency medical technicians, et cetera. They worked on the barges. They unloaded trucks of debris. At Staten Island, Fresh Hills, Detective Walcott told me you could see when it snowed how it melted, and it would just shine. There would be a sheen to some of these toxins that was just like burning. I mean, some of the things, the 91,000 liters of burning jet fuel with the benzene, and it burned for Nashville and came up north. And after being semi-retired from the practice of law to raise my kids, I obviously came out of retirement. I kept writing as best I could, but this became an all-encompassing, all-draining. I was talking earlier to my scholarship beneficiary up this year that in litigation, and I learned this from Professor Packel and from Professor McNamara in trial practice, that in litigation, being creative, working your way around things, and sometimes saying, this is where I want to go, and knowing that. It's almost like when you first sign up a case, dreaming up what your summation might sound like, what kind of jury you might want on your case, rather than waiting until the moment, because those creative surges. So this case took a ton of creativity on everyone's part. Judge Hellerstein spent enormous amounts of time trying to resolve it. Mike Bloomberg, who originally was against compensating these people, became heroic in his efforts in convincing everyone that this compensation must take place. And ultimately, of the 10,000 people, 9,999 are settled.
Thank you, David, for those very inspiring remarks, for those words of wisdom, particularly the importance, I think, of finding your place and passion in the law and following through on that. And in giving back to the community, you really do exemplify the best, as I said at the beginning, of what is a true Villanova lawyer, and that is a leader that serves their community.